Hello and welcome to Chapter 4, Medical, Legal, and Ethical Issues. We're going to talk about scope of practice, patient consent and refusal, and some other legal issues. Scope of practice. So this is basically what you can and can't do on the job. Um, it's the regulations and ethical decisions or considerations that define the scope or extent of, and limits of an EMT's job. In Missouri, you guys are, as EMTs, um, adhere to the national scope of practice with a few exceptions. And those exceptions are placement of a supraglottic airway device, which we'll get into Chapter 9. Um, Glucometer. You guys can take a glucometer reading, and 12 lead acquisition and transmission. So those are the few things that are above the national scope of practice, but you guys can do. It may include skills and medical interventions, and it's defined by state legislation and regulation, regional rules and guidelines. We don't really have any regional rules and guidelines. It's more just what you guys can do, what you can't do um, in the state. Standard of care. So there's a difference between scope of practice and standard of care. Scope of practice is what you can do. Standard of care is how you should do it. So that standard of care basically says you as an EMT would do this for this patient in this area, and in the next town over, or the next whatever, that another EMT would do the same thing for that same patient. So that's standard of care. So there is a difference, and it's the care that would be expected from an EMT with similar training when caring for a patient in a similar situation. And this is what gets you legally and in that sense, because if you don't perform to the standard of care, then you could be legally held responsible. Um, and maintaining your skills and knowledge as well as participate in quality improvement. This is all standard of care. Um, Being an EMT is a lifelong learning job. You never stop learning. That's why we have continuing education. That's why we have this quality improvement. Yeah. Consent and refusal. So consent is permission to pay from the patient to assess, treat, and transport. Um, there's a couple different types of consent. There's express consent. Uh, this is consent given by adults who are of legal age and mentally competent to make a rational decision in regard to their medical well-being. And it must be informed. Patient needs to understand the risks associated with the care they will receive. Um, in my opinion, express consent and this permission to assess, treat, and transport the patient begins when they call 911. So I know a little bit later on it's gonna tell you that you need to ask for permission to treat and treat your patient. Um, but in my opinion, it starts when that patient calls 911, and how when they call 911, that basically says, "Hey, I'm calling for help." Um, so that's my permission, my consent, or that patient's consent to treat them. Now, there are a few exceptions. When family members call 911 for a patient, and that patient doesn't want to go, or something like that. So then, yeah, then we're gonna have to ask. Implied consent. So this is assumed consent as well. This can be an unconscious patient. They may be physically or mentally incapacitated, but they still need medical care. And under this consent, it allows us to treat those patients um, until they become conscious and able to make those rational decisions. This implied consent basically says any normal, sane adult would want to be treated for the condition that they're currently having if they're unconscious. Children and mentally incompetent adults. So minors are not legally permitted to provide consent or refusal for treatment. We have to obtain that from the parent or legal guardian. If there is no parent or legal guardian, then we treat them under that implied consent. Again, any adult parent would want their child to be treated for the condition that they're experiencing or whatever's going on. So we treat them under implied consent. There are some exceptions to this, meaning that if we can't get a hold of a parent or legal guardian, or there's some issues, then we have some exceptions. In loco parentis, so this is when your child is at school. The school legally has the right to treat your child and make those decisions when the parent can't. This isn't just parents or the schools. It's can be foster care. It can be in the cases of like my kid goes to sleep over at somebody's house and they get injured and they can't get a hold of me, then they have they're under their care at that moment, so they can make those decisions to care for that my child. Emancipated minors. These are kids who are under the age of 18 who have been emancipated, such as pregnancy, childbirth, they have a kid of their own, or they are legally emancipated by the court system. Life-threatening illness or injury, again, that we treat those under implied consent. So yeah, and then minors who have children kind of goes under the emancipated minor. And then minors serving in the armed forces as well. They have the ability to make their own decisions. Involuntary transportation. So a patient is considered a threat to themselves or others. They have a court order. It usually requires a decision by a mental health professional or police officer. If a patient is restrained, you want to ensure that the patient's health and well-being during this time. We do restrain patients. We do involuntary transport. I typically, we can't involuntary transport somebody who is legally competent unless they are a threat to themselves or others. And in that case, I make sure that we have PD on scene, and then we do what's called a 96-hour hold, where the officer writes an affidavit, and then they go to the court and say, hey, this person needs a 96-hour hold. The judge places a 96-hour hold on that patient, and then they get transported to the hospital, typically to the ER first, and then after the ER, they go to the facility, like a mental health facility. So, yeah. Patients may refuse care or transport under the following circumstances. They have to be legally able to consent. So they have to be above that age of 18. They have to be an emancipated minor, or any one of those other things. They must be awake and oriented. So they have to be alert, and they have to be oriented. So this orientation is, are they able to tell me what day it is, what year it is, who they are, what's going on, all that stuff. Okay. The patient must be fully informed and understand. That last part, the understanding, is of utmost importance. Okay. If they can't understand that refusing care is going to harm them in some way, then they need to go to the hospital. Okay. And the patient will be asked to sign a release form. We call it a PRC, patient refusal of care. It just kind of depends on the service, but that patient refusal of care is basically saying, hey, we came, we checked you out, you didn't want to go with us. You understand that if we leave and something goes wrong, that we're not liable, that you've made this informed decision to do this, then that's on you. However, even though this patient understands this and has signed this release form, we can still be held liable for those things. And we have been held liable for those things. PRCs are probably the one thing that gets us in the most trouble, because the documentation isn't filled out correctly, or we didn't do something for the patient that we should have done on scene to make sure that they had an informed decision. So, take all possible actions to persuade the patient to accept care and transport. Spend time speaking with the patient. Listen carefully to try to determine why the patient is refusing care, and inform the patient of the consequences of not going to the hospital. This is an essential component of every refusal of care situation, every time. I personally have spent an hour trying to convince a patient to try and go to the hospital because I didn't think that they needed to stay. They really needed to go to the hospital, in my opinion. And so I listened. He was worried about his dogs. So I was able to find a neighbor to take care of his dogs. And then he finally went to the hospital. Consult med control if you need to. Sometimes you'll have to. I've done it once or twice on a PRC, but of course, if the patient is alert and oriented and not wanting to go to the hospital, then we can't force them to go. And ask the patient if it's all right if you call them a family member, or advise the patient that you would like to call a family member. Sometimes family can kind of convince the patient to go a little bit better than we can. So having that backup, so to speak, would be helpful. Call law enforcement if necessary. Ask the patient to sign the refusal of care form used by your agency as well. Subjecting the patient to unwanted care and transport has actually been viewed in the court as assault or battery. So assault, there's a difference between assault and battery. Assault is the threat of hitting somebody, and the battery is the actual action of hitting somebody. Or in this case, I threaten the patient to go to the hospital. I'm gonna take you to the hospital. That's assault. And then battery would be me actually physically putting my hands on the patient and putting them on the cot and all that. Have witnesses to the refusal. Inform the patient that if they change their mind, they can call back. And if possible, have friends or relative remain with the patient. And document your attempts thoroughly. Okay. Documentation is probably one of the most important things that we can do in EMS. It covers our butts in legality wise. So yeah, just document. DNRs and physician orders for life-sustaining treatment. So these are legal documents expressing what the patient wishes if the patient is unable to speak for themselves. DNRs, so they may be part of an advance directive as well. May be part of a physician order for life-sustaining treatment, and you should also be familiar with living wills and healthcare proxies. So DNRs, it's a do not resuscitate. If the patient doesn't want to be resuscitated, they have a form that says that they do not want any kind of life-saving measures, heroic measures to save their lives if they were to go into cardiac arrest. Advanced directives are basically those things that say, hey, this is what I want done in case something were to happen to me. And then living wills kind of do go along the same way, where they go into more detail of this is what I would like done if I am unconscious, or if I need treatment of some kind. This is what I want done. That's that living will. Healthcare proxies. So these are actually forms, kind of like a person who is in charge of the medical decisions if they need to be. So this is a tattoo, okay? It's a living will tattoo. This has not been able to be held up in court, mainly because it's a tattoo. I understand that it's all signed and all that stuff, but there was not actually those people did not actually sign that. They signed a piece of paper, and then that piece of paper was then placed on the patient's arm, and it was tattooed on there. So yeah, I mean, it's not one of those things that is legal. However, if I were to find this on a patient that was in a code, I would probably consult medical control and say, hey, this is the deal. You know, I'll work him until you tell me what to do. Other legal issues, so negligence. This is something that should have been done that was not done or was done incorrectly. The person who is charging you with negligence has to prove that the EMT had a duty to act, that there was a breach of that duty, EMT failed to provide standard of care expected or failed to act, and that there's proximate causation, that the patient suffered harm because of the EMT's action or inaction. And then negligent EMTs may be required to pay damages. You'll see these on tests. They will be out there. So a duty to act basically says, hey, you're working a job, you got toned out to a call, and you had a duty. Breach of duty would be that you either didn't respond to the call, or that you performed some type of care that wasn't expected, or that you failed to act on that that duty. And then obviously the proximate causation is when the patient suffered harm because of your action or inaction. Lawsuits against EMTs are usually classified as torts. Res ipsa loquitur, the thing speaks for itself, is a legal concept important in negligence cases. It allows a finding of negligence even when there is no specific evidence of a negligent act. The two most common and significant causes of lawsuits against EMTs are patient refusal and ambulance collisions. So let's talk about that duty to act a little bit more. So there was an obligation to provide care to a patient either on an ambulance and dispatched to a call. That duty to act is not always clear. It can be off duty or on duty, but out of jurisdiction. If you're off duty, there is no legal duty to act, but there is an ethical duty to act. And then on duty but out of jurisdiction, we're blessed with our medical director because he's basically said, hey, if you're off duty or on duty and out of jurisdiction, I will cover you as long as you're in the state. So as long as we do everything that we're supposed to do, the standard of care, then we're good. Abandonment. So once care is initiated, it may not be discontinued until transferred to a medical personnel of equal or greater training. Failure to do so may constitute abandonment. So you, as EMTs, have to transfer care to a either EMT, paramedic, or nurse, or doctor. I, as a paramedic, have to transfer care if I have initiated any kind of advanced life support. And here's where the kicker is. So we BLS calls all the time, okay? If we go on a call and the patient, even though I'm on scene as a paramedic, and the patient doesn't need my services particularly, then I'll BLS the call, and my EMT partner will take that patient. It's not considered abandonment. I'm still technically with the patient. I'm not going anywhere. But I have not done any kind of advanced life support procedures or anything to that patient as of yet. So as far as that concern, it's not abandonment. Where it becomes abandonment and where the questions become, where the issue becomes questionable is when you take your patient to the hospital and you leave them in a hall bed without giving any kind of care, transfer of care or anything like that to the nurse or somebody at the hospital. We have in recent times, because of COVID, because of the short staffing, because of the increased call volume, there have been some issues where patients have been just taken to the hospital, dropped off, and just left. So it could constitute as abandonment depending on the court and how they want to view it. Good Samaritan laws. So these grant immunity from liability if a rescuer acts in good faith within the level of training. May not cover EMTs in some situations, and it does not protect persons from gross negligence or violations of the law. So in Missouri, we have Good Samaritan laws, and it basically says, hey, if I go on scene, or as an EMT, it covers CPR and all that. It basically says, hey, if I go on scene as an EMT and I do, something at an EMT level, like check a patient's sugar with a glucometer, or place in blind airway insertion device. If I do any of that, I'm technically covered under Good Samaritan laws. So here's a question for you. If I, as a paramedic, go on scene and do things for that patient at the advanced level, so like say my patient needs an airway and I'm not able to give them an airway very well, so then I do a surgical correct where I cut into their neck and I put a tube in their neck directly into their trachea to help them breathe. Is that covered under Good Samaritan? So this is where it becomes questionable and iffy. So technically, I'm acting in good faith. I'm acting within the level of my training, right? I'm not outside of my scope of practice. I'm not outside of, anything like that. However, here's where it becomes tricky. I am not currently on duty. So I'm not acting under a medical director. I am also So I'm basically practicing without a medical license. um, I am also in possession, if I were to use a surgical cric kit, I'm also in possession of medical equipment. Now, granted, I can go on eBay, I can go to Amazon, I can, go anywhere and basically purchase those things. But I'm in possession of that medical equipment, and that's where it becomes tricky because sometimes, yeah, I can do that. Should I do that? Is there a different way? Is there something else I can do? And hopefully that medic is good enough that says, hey, um, yeah, there's other things you can do besides that. Confidentiality. So this is information on patient's history, condition, treatment, considered confidential. HIPAA. We all know what HIPAA is. This is information shared with other healthcare personnel as part of the patient's continuing care. Otherwise, that must be obtained through a subpoena. And we all know that um, we've heard the issues surrounding the COVID-19 cards and whether or not that's a HIPAA violation, and it really isn't. It's not a HIPAA violation because they can ask for it. You can tell them or not tell them. It only becomes a HIPAA violation if and when I, as a healthcare professional, know that you have a COVID-19 card, and I go in and tell somebody else that you have a COVID-19 vaccination. Um, and that's where it becomes an issue. Now, if I gain that knowledge outside of being in the healthcare field, it's not a HIPAA violation. Okay. If I gained that knowledge inside the healthcare profession, in the course of my job, and I go and tell somebody else that it's a HIPAA that you have a COVID-19 vaccine, then yeah, it's a HIPAA violation. But it's not a HIPAA violation if they ask for it. Okay, they can ask for it. It's up to you to determine whether or not you want to give it. So yeah. Um, as far as anything else goes, basically don't share information about a patient's stuff. Okay. Um, it's a $25,000 fine per um, incident and possible loss of medical license or the right to practice. So it's a big deal. Don't do it. Special situations, including organ donors. So organ donors have completed some type of legal document allowing donation of organs and tissues in the event of death. May be identified by family members, donor card, driver's license. Here I've included Missouri's driver's license that has the little heart with the green ribbon on it, and donor. It's just basically signifying that they are a donor. And the receiving hospital and or medical direction should be advised per protocol. If they are an organ donor, we're going to keep a heartbeat in them as much as possible. If we need to do CPR on them, then we can do that while we go to the hospital. But yeah. Safe haven laws. So these allow a person to drop off an infant or child at any fire, police, or EMS station. And there are other issues, other places. You can actually drop off your kid at a McDonald's. McDonald's is a safe haven. And the states have different guidelines for ages of children included. In Missouri, it's a newborn up to 45 days old without prosecution. And actually, you can drop off your child up to the age of 18, potentially without prosecution. After 45 days, you can be prosecuted for abandonment or something like that. But it's a case-by-case issue. So, crime scenes. So, in crime scenes, it's the location where a crime was committed or anywhere evidence may be found. Once police have made scenes safe, our priority is patient care. We want to know what evidence is and take steps to preserve that evidence. So, it's just one of those things where we go in, we look, and we make sure that if we move something, we know where it got moved from, so that way we can tell a police officer or something like that. Okay. Examples of evidence include the condition of the scene, the patient, fingerprints and footprints, microscopic evidence as well. In cases of the patient, what I do for any kind of potential evidence is I burrito the patient, so I lay a sheet flat on the cot, and then we place the patient on that sheet, and then I roll them up in that sheet. So if any evidence were to come off of the patient during transport or something like that, then that evidence is preserved in that sheet, and they take the sheet and analyze it. Just remember what you touch, minimize your impact on the scene, and work with police. Special reporting requirements. So children, elderly and domestic abuse, human trafficking, violence, gunshot wounds, stabbing, sexual assault, and situations where restraint may be necessary. You guys are mandated reporters now, so you guys have a duty to report incidents of these. Child and elderly abuse are probably the biggest things that you'll report. Typically, if we go on a gunshot or stabbing, PD's already there, and that's who you're going to report that to anyway. Sexual assault, again, PD, and any kind of situation where restraint may be necessary as well. Documentation. Okay. Intoxicated persons with injuries, mentally incompetent people with injuries, and just make sure that you follow your local protocols for all of that. Ethical responsibilities. So morality is the personal opinions about right and wrong. Ethics is a standard of behavior for a profession. Ethical expectations for EMTs. You want to be honest in reporting, refrain from any kind of actions that cause harm to a patient, and work to help the patient. Respect the right of the adult patients to make their own decisions. Treat all patients fairly and justly. Assist others to learn your profession and report misconduct. And then also make sure research is approved. Okay. So these are all ethical responsibilities of you as an EMT. Just if it doesn't seem right, don't do it. If it doesn't seem right, report it. If it feels off, report it. I mean, it's just one of those things where you have ethical duties as a person to, make sure that it's being done right. So this concludes Chapter 4, Medical, Legal, and Ethical Issues. If you have any questions, let me know. And then, as always, just let me know if you have any questions. And I will see you on the next chapter.